I discovered the truth about my apartment on a Tuesday morning in late September, standing in what used to be my grandmother's bedroom, watching two strangers strip away layers of floral wallpaper that had been there since 1952. They were my new landlords, Marcus and Stephanie Chen, and they were talking about me as if I weren't standing right there, as if 73 years of occupancy meant nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle to their renovation plans. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The wallpaper was hideous, I'll admit that freely. Enormous pink cabbage roses tangled with jade green leaves, the kind of pattern that could induce headaches if you stared at it too long. My grandmother Cecilia had chosen it herself in the early 50s, shortly after my grandfather Vincent died, and she'd refused every suggestion to replace it over the subsequent decades. It reminds me of the garden we had in Sicily, she'd say whenever I wrinkled my nose at it as a child. Before we came to America with nothing but hope and stubbornness. I'm Louisa Ferrante, though most people in the building still call me Lou, or sometimes Little Louisa to distinguish me from my grandmother, who everyone called Big Lou despite being barely 5 feet tall. At 47, I suppose I'm no longer particularly little, but nicknames have a way of sticking in neighborhoods like this, in buildings where generations have layered their lives on top of each other like sediment, creating a history you can almost touch. The Chens had purchased the building 3 months ago from the Kowalski family, who had owned it for 60 years. Old Mr. Kowalski had passed away the previous winter, and his children, scattered across the country with their own lives and priorities, had sold to the first serious offer. The sale happened so quickly that those of us living here barely had time to process the change before we were receiving notices about renovations, rent increases, and modernization plans that made my stomach clench with anxiety. I'd lived in apartment 4B my entire life. Born in the bedroom where Marcus Chen was now enthusiastically tearing down my grandmother's wallpaper, raised in these rooms that smelled of garlic and tomato sauce and the specific mustiness that comes from books kept too long in humid climates. My mother Isabella had grown up here too, sleeping in the small second bedroom until she married my father Antonio, and they moved exactly 3 floors down to apartment 1B. When Papa died in a construction accident when I was 6, Mama and I moved back upstairs with Nana Cecilia, and we'd been here ever since. Mama passed away 4 years ago from complications of diabetes, leaving me alone in the apartment that had housed 3 generations of Ferrante women. Nana had died a decade before that, at the impressive age of 92, still insisting the wallpaper stayed exactly as it was. I'd honored that wish even though friends and the occasional boyfriend suggested I update the place, make it more modern, more mine. But the wallpaper had become a kind of shrine, a connection to the women who'd raised me, who'd taught me that stubbornness and hope could carry you through almost anything. This wallpaper is a crime against design, Stephanie said now, wrinkling her nose as another strip peeled away in her husband's hands. She was young, maybe 30, with that particular brand of confidence that comes from never having been told no about anything important. I can't believe anyone lived with this pattern for 70 years. It's practically psychedelic. The previous tenant was elderly, Marcus replied, as if I weren't standing 5 feet away from them, probably didn't even see it anymore. You know how old people are about change. I wasn't elderly. I was 47, still working full-time as a paralegal at Morrison & Associates downtown, still going to yoga twice a week, still very much present and aware. But to the Chens, anyone who'd choose to keep vintage wallpaper must be ancient and out of touch with contemporary aesthetics. Excuse me, I said, my voice sharper than I'd intended. I'm the tenant. I'm standing right here. And that wallpaper belonged to my grandmother. Stephanie had the grace to look momentarily embarrassed, though it passed quickly. Oh, Louisa, we didn't mean any offense. It's just that the apartment needs updating. We're trying to bring the whole building into the 21st century. By raising everyone's rent 30% and forcing out people who've lived here for decades, I pointed out, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. Marcus set down the scraper he'd been using, turning to face me with an expression of practiced patience. We've been more than fair, Louisa. We gave everyone 60 days notice as required by law, and we're offering assistance with moving costs if you need to find alternative housing. Alternative housing? As if I could find anything remotely affordable in this neighborhood anymore. As if there were another apartment anywhere that held the accumulated memories of my entire life. The scratches on the doorframe where Nana had marked my height every birthday, the loose floorboard in the kitchen where Mama used to hide emergency money, the window seat in the living room where 3 generations of Ferrante women had sat reading on Sunday afternoons. I have a lease, I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew how weak they sounded. My lease was month to month, had been for years since Nana's original rental agreement had expired and Mr. Kowalski had never bothered to formalize anything new. We'd operated on handshake agreements and neighborly trust, the old-fashioned way that worked perfectly fine until someone decided trust wasn't profitable enough. Which we're happy to honor until it expires at the end of this month, Stephanie said smoothly. Then you'll have the option to stay at the new rental rate or relocate. It's entirely your choice. My choice. The phrase was laughable. The new rate was nearly $3,000 a month for a 2-bedroom apartment I'd been paying $800 for. On my paralegal salary, I could barely afford a studio in the outer boroughs at that price, certainly nothing in Manhattan, nothing in the neighborhood where my family had put down roots in 1947 when my great-grandparents arrived from Sicily with 2 suitcases and dreams of a better life. I watched Marcus return to his wallpaper stripping, attacking the roses with renewed vigor. Each strip that came away felt like losing another piece of my grandmother, another connection to the past being literally peeled off and discarded as trash. Under the roses, older layers were visible. A stripe pattern from the 40s, plain beige from possibly the 30s, each one a chapter in the apartment's history. Being demolished without ceremony or respect. You know, I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. My grandmother paid for extensive renovations to this apartment in 1965. New bathroom, updated kitchen, repairs to the plaster walls. Mr. Kowalski's father agreed she could deduct it from her rent over time. Marcus paused, glancing at Stephanie. That's interesting, but it doesn't really affect the current situation. Whatever arrangements were made decades ago, they're not binding on us as new owners. I'm just saying my family has invested in this building. We're not just tenants who've been paying the minimum and letting the place fall apart. We've contributed to maintaining and improving these apartments. Stephanie's smile was sympathetic but firm. We appreciate that, Louisa, we really do. But the reality is that the building needs significant work, and we have to recoup our investment. Surely you understand basic economics. I understood economics just fine. I understood that buildings in this neighborhood that had sold for reasonable prices 20 years ago were now worth millions. I understood that long-time tenants with affordable rents were obstacles to maximizing profit. I understood that my grandmother's ugly wallpaper and my family's 73-year history meant absolutely nothing compared to the Chen's renovation plans and rental income projections. I'll leave you to your work, I said, turning toward the door before they could see the tears threatening at the corners of my eyes. Louisa, Stephanie called after me. We're not trying to be cruel. We're just trying to run a business. Maybe it's time to think about this as an opportunity for a fresh start? A fresh start. At 47, with barely enough savings to cover first month, last month, and security deposit on a new place. A fresh start away from the only home I'd ever known, from the building where Mr. Chen on the 2nd floor still saved me homemade dumplings, where Mrs. Rodriguez across the hall had watched me grow up and now watered my plants when I traveled, where every corner held some memory of the women who'd raised me to believe that home meant something more than square footage and rental rates. I closed the apartment door behind me and stood in the hallway, pressing my palm against the wood that had been painted and repainted so many times the original grain was barely visible. Down the hall I could hear the Chens laughing about something, their voices carrying the easy confidence of people who'd never had to worry about being displaced, who'd never understood that some things mattered more than updates and modern aesthetics. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from my best friend Diana. Coffee tomorrow? Need to hear how the landlord situation is going. Diana had been encouraging me to fight, to find a lawyer, to look for any possible loophole that might let me stay. But what was there to fight? The law was clear. The Chens owned the building. They could raise rents to market rate. They could choose not to renew leases. Month-to-month tenants like me had virtually no protection, especially in a building that wasn't subject to rent stabilization laws. I texted back a thumbs-up emoji, too tired to explain that there was nothing new to report except the slow, inevitable demolition of everything my grandmother had created. That evening I sat in my living room with a glass of wine, looking at the old photo albums I'd pulled from the closet. Nana Cecilia in her wedding dress, standing in front of this very building in 1946, just months after she and Nano Vincent had arrived in New York. Mama as a little girl, playing on the fire escape that had been removed in some long-ago safety upgrade. Me at every age, birthday parties and graduations and ordinary Sundays, all of them taking place within these walls. The apartment felt different now that the Chens had been inside it, as if their presence had contaminated something sacred. I could still smell Stephanie's expensive perfume lingering in the air, still hear Marcus's dismissive comments about elderly tenants and outdated design. My phone rang. Diana, unable to wait until tomorrow for coffee. Tell me everything, she demanded the moment I answered. Did they actually come into your apartment?
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I explained about the wallpaper, about their casual cruelty disguised as business necessity, about the way they discussed me as if I were an abstract problem rather than a person whose life was being upended. There has to be something, Diana insisted. She was a corporate attorney, used to finding angles and loopholes, convinced that every problem had a legal solution if you just looked hard enough. What about those renovations you mentioned? The ones your grandmother paid for? That was 60 years ago, Dee. I don't even know if any documentation exists. But if it does, she pressed, if there's proof that your family made significant financial contributions to the property, that could establish some kind of claim. At minimum, it might give you leverage to negotiate a better deal. I wanted to believe her, wanted to think that my grandmother's fastidious record-keeping might have preserved something useful. Nana had kept everything, every receipt, every letter, every document, all of it stuffed into shoe boxes and filing cabinets that I'd never fully sorted through after she died. I'll look, I promised, though I didn't hold out much hope. Even if I found receipts for the 1965 renovations, what did that prove? That my family had been good tenants who'd maintained the apartment? The Chens didn't care about that. They cared about profit margins and return on investment. After hanging up with Diana, I poured another glass of wine and stood at the window, looking out at the street where I'd learned to ride a bike, where I'd kissed my first boyfriend, where I'd returned after every college break and every failed relationship, always finding comfort in the familiar rhythms of the neighborhood. Below, I could see the bodega where Mr. Patel still remembered that I liked my coffee light with 2 sugars, the restaurant where the owner's grandmother had taught my grandmother how to make proper marinara sauce, the pharmacy where 3 generations of Ferrantes had picked up prescriptions and birthday cards and emergency late-night supplies. This wasn't just an apartment. It was the physical manifestation of my family's American story, the place where immigrants had become New Yorkers, where struggle had gradually transformed into stability, where hope and stubbornness had built something lasting. Or so I'd thought. The next morning I woke early, unable to sleep past dawn despite having stayed up too late drinking wine and wallowing in memories. I made coffee in the kitchen where my grandmother had taught me to cook, where the tiles were chipped but clean, where the cabinets were old but perfectly functional. The Chens would rip all of this out, replace it with stainless steel and granite, charge someone $3,000 a month for the privilege of living in what they'd market as a newly renovated classic pre-war. Before leaving for work, I opened the hall closet where Nana's boxes were still stacked, untouched except for the occasional moment when I needed an old photo or document. I'd always meant to properly sort through everything, to organize and preserve my family's history, but there had never seemed to be any urgency. Nana had been dead for 10 years, Mama for 4. Their papers could wait. Now, looking at the towers of shoe boxes and the ancient filing cabinet pushed into the back corner, I felt a sudden desperation to look, to search, to find something, anything that might help. But I had to get to work, had a deposition to prepare for, had actual responsibilities that couldn't be postponed for a probably futile treasure hunt through 70-year-old receipts. Tonight, I promised the boxes. I'll look tonight. Work was a welcome distraction, the familiar routine of legal documents and client meetings providing a temporary escape from my personal crisis. I'd been at Morrison & Associates for 12 years, had worked my way up from receptionist to paralegal, was good at my job, respected by the attorneys I supported. It was stable, predictable work that paid reasonably well, at least well enough to live comfortably as long as my rent stayed at $800 a month. "You look exhausted," my colleague Jennifer observed over lunch. "Landlord stuff still bad?" I nodded, picking at my salad without appetite. "They were in my apartment yesterday, stripping my grandmother's wallpaper, talking about me like I wasn't even there." Jennifer winced sympathetically. She owned a condo in Queens, had escaped the uncertainty of renting years ago, when she and her husband combined their incomes and took the leap into ownership. "Have you thought about looking into first-time buyer programs? Maybe it's time to invest in your own place?" The suggestion was well-meaning but laughably out of touch with my reality. "With what down payment? I have maybe $15,000 in savings. That's not enough to buy anything in this city, even with programs for first-time buyers. What about moving to New Jersey? Or further out in Queens? What about leaving the only neighborhood I'd ever known? The community that had supported 3 generations of my family, the streets that held my entire history?" But I couldn't explain that to Jennifer, who saw housing as a simple matter of numbers and square footage, who didn't understand that some places were irreplaceable regardless of how much sense it made financially to consider alternatives. The afternoon dragged, my attention wandering from the deposition transcript I was supposed to be reviewing. I kept thinking about those boxes in my closet, about Nana's obsessive record-keeping, about the slim possibility that somewhere in all that paper might be something useful. Diana's words echoed in my mind. "If there's proof that your family made significant financial contributions to the property, that could establish some kind of claim." At 5 o'clock, I grabbed my things and headed home, stopping at the bodega for coffee even though it was too late in the day for caffeine. Mr. Patel asked about my family as he always did, and I gave him the abbreviated version. "New landlords, rent increase, probably moving soon. This neighborhood is changing," he said sadly, shaking his head. "All the families who've been here for generations, being pushed out by people who can afford to pay more. It's not right." It wasn't right, but that didn't seem to matter. What mattered was market rates and profit margins, and the inexorable forces of gentrification that treated longtime residents as obstacles to progress rather than as the foundation of community. Back in my apartment, I changed into comfortable clothes and approached the closet with renewed determination. I pulled out the first box, a battered Florsheim shoebox that had once held my grandfather's dress shoes, now crammed with what appeared to be receipts from the 1950s. Grocery bills, utility payments, a receipt for a washing machine purchased in 1953. Nothing useful, but I couldn't bring myself to throw any of it away. This was my family's life, documented in fading ink on yellowing paper. The second box held letters, dozens of them, written in Italian in my grandmother's flowing script. Letters to her sister back in Sicily, chronicling the early years in America, the struggle to learn English, the joy of finally saving enough to move from a cramped studio in Little Italy to this apartment in 1947. I set them aside carefully, making a mental note to someday have them translated, to preserve these stories before they were lost entirely. 3 hours later, I worked my way through half the boxes and found nothing remotely related to the 1965 renovations. My back ached from sitting on the floor, my hands were filthy from decades of accumulated dust, and my initial optimism had faded into grim resignation. This was pointless. Even if I found receipts, what would that prove? I was about to give up for the night when I reached for the filing cabinet pushed against the back wall. It was ancient, heavy, the kind of metal furniture that lasted forever precisely because it was built like a tank. I'd never paid much attention to it, had assumed it held more of the same random papers and receipts that filled the boxes. The top drawer was stuck, resisting my attempts to pull it open. I yanked harder, and it finally gave way with a screech of metal on metal that made me wince. Inside were hanging folders, meticulously labeled in my grandmother's handwriting. Bills, taxes, medical insurance. I flipped through them quickly, finding mostly what I expected. Then, at the very back, a folder simply labeled important. Inside were documents I'd never seen before. My grandmother's naturalization certificate from 1952. My mother's birth certificate. My grandfather's death certificate from 1951. And underneath those, a thick envelope with apartment written across the front in Nana's careful script. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it, not daring to hope but unable to suppress the flutter of anticipation. Inside were rental receipts going back to 1947, each one noting the monthly payment of $60 to Kowalski Properties. A copy of the original lease signed by my grandmother and Stanislaw Kowalski, Vincent's father, for a term of 1 year with option to renew. And then something I hadn't expected. A letter dated May 15, 1965, addressed to Mrs. Cecilia Ferrante from Stanislaw Kowalski. I began to read, my heart pounding harder with each line. Dear Mrs. Ferrante, this letter confirms our agreement regarding renovations to apartment 4B. In recognition of your proposal to finance improvements to the bathroom, kitchen and plaster repairs at a total cost of $3,200, I agree to the following arrangement. You will front the cost of all renovations using contractors of your choosing, subject to my approval. In exchange, your monthly rent will be reduced to $20 per month until the full amount is recovered. Based on your current rent of $85 per month, this represents a $65 monthly reduction and will take approximately 4 years to fully repay your investment. Furthermore, in recognition of your family's long tenancy and the significant improvement these renovations will bring to the building, I agree that upon completion of repayment, your rent will be permanently fixed at $85 per month for the duration of your occupancy. This agreement is binding upon my heirs and successors. I read it 3 times, my mind racing. This wasn't just a receipt for renovations. This was a contract signed by both parties, guaranteeing my grandmother a permanent fixed rent rate. And more importantly, stating that it was binding upon heirs and successors. Did that include the Chens? My hands were shaking now as I pulled out my phone to call Diana. She answered on the second ring. I found something, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Dee, I think I found something important. Diana arrived at my apartment 40 minutes later, still in her work clothes, her briefcase clutched in one hand and a bottle of wine in the other. She'd taken a rideshare from her office in Midtown, abandoning whatever evening plan she'd had the moment I'd told her about the letter. That was Diana, always ready to drop everything when someone she loved needed her, a quality that had sustained our friendship since we'd met in high school nearly 30 years ago. I had the letter waiting on the kitchen table, alongside the rest of the documents from the envelope. I'd read it so many times in the past hour that I'd practically memorized every word. But each reading brought new questions, new possibilities, new fears that I might be misinterpreting something crucial. Diana set down the wine and picked up the letter, her attorney's eyes scanning it with professional efficiency. I watched her face, trying to read her expression, looking for any sign that this might be the miracle I desperately needed. She said nothing as she read, then read again, her finger tracing certain phrases as if testing their weight and validity. Well, I finally asked, unable to bear the silence any longer. She set the letter down carefully, as if it were something fragile and precious. Lou, this is extraordinary. I need to do more research, need to verify the legal precedents, but on its face, this looks like a binding agreement that should have been disclosed during the sale of the building. My heart leaped. So it means something? The Chens can't just ignore it? Diana held up a cautionary hand. Let me be clear about what we're dealing with here. This is a contract between your grandmother and the previous owner. The critical phrase is binding upon my heirs and successors. In property law, certain agreements can run with the land, meaning they transfer to new owners regardless of whether those owners were aware of them. But, and this is important, there are specific requirements for that to happen. She pulled out her laptop, already shifting into research mode. The agreement needs to be properly recorded, or there needs to be clear evidence that subsequent owners were aware of its existence and accepted its terms. Do you have any proof that the younger Kowalski, the one who just sold the building, knew about this agreement? I shook my head, feeling my brief hope beginning to deflate. I never discussed rent with him. He just cashed my checks every month. $800, which is what it had been since the early 90s when his father raised it from the original $85. Wait, Diana looked up sharply. Your grandmother paid $85 a month from 1969 until when? I thought back, trying to remember the conversations I'd had with Nana about rent. She said old Mr. Kowalski, Stanislaw, kept it at $85 until he died in 1991. Then his son Michael took over and raised it to $800. Said costs were going up, and he needed to adjust rents to cover expenses. Nana complained about it, but she paid. She was in her 70s by then, didn't want to fight. Diana was typing rapidly, her expression intense with concentration. So for 22 years, from 1969 to 1991, the agreement was honored exactly as written. Then Michael Kowalski raises the rent dramatically, but your grandmother accepts it. That could be interpreted as her agreeing to modify the original contract. She didn't have a choice, I protested. Where was she going to go at 75 years old? I understand that, Lou, but from a legal standpoint, she continued to pay the new amount without formal protest or legal challenge. That could be seen as acceptance. Diana must have seen the devastation on my face because she quickly added, but that doesn't necessarily invalidate the original agreement. There are doctrines of unconscionability, arguments about duress and unequal bargaining power. We're not defeated yet. She continued researching while I poured us both wine, trying to settle my racing thoughts. The initial euphoria of finding the letter had been replaced by a more complicated mix of hope and anxiety. I'd found something, yes, but whether it was enough to actually help me remained uncertain. Tell me about the wallpaper, Diana said suddenly, looking up from her laptop. You said they were stripping it yesterday. The wallpaper your grandmother put up in 1952? Yes, those horrible roses. Why? Because I'm wondering what else might be hidden under there. Diana's eyes gleamed with the particular intensity she got when she was onto something. Your grandmother kept this agreement in a folder marked important, hidden in the back of a filing cabinet. She was clearly someone who understood the value of documentation, who knew this letter was significant. What if she hid other things? What if there's something behind that wallpaper? The idea seemed far-fetched, almost ridiculous. Like what? She put the wallpaper up 13 years before the renovation agreement. She wouldn't have known she'd need to hide anything. Maybe not in 1952, but what about later? What about in 1991 when Michael Kowalski broke the agreement and raised her rent? What if she hid a copy of the letter, or other documents, somewhere she thought no one would look? Diana was pacing now, her mind clearly racing ahead. You said she refused to ever let anyone change that wallpaper, right? Made you promise to keep it even after she died? I nodded slowly, remembering Nana's unusual insistence about the wallpaper. At the time, I'd attributed it to sentimentality, to an old woman's attachment to the past. But what if there had been another reason? The Chens are coming back tomorrow to finish stripping the bedroom, I said. They're planning to have the whole apartment cleared out by the end of the week so they can start renovations as soon as I move out. Diana grabbed her phone. We need to stop them. Right now, before they destroy potential evidence. On what grounds? It's their building. They have the right to renovate. Not if doing so would destroy documents that are relevant to a legal dispute about the property. Diana was already dialing. I'm calling my colleague Tom, he specializes in property law. If he agrees this letter is significant, we can potentially get a temporary restraining order preventing them from continuing renovation work until we've had a chance to properly examine the apartment. While Diana talked to her colleague, laying out the situation in rapid legal shorthand, I walked to the bedroom and stared at the partially stripped walls. The Chens had removed about a third of the wallpaper yesterday, revealing the layers beneath. Stripes from the 40s, plain beige from earlier still, and underneath everything the original plaster walls, yellowed with age but solid. I ran my hand over a section where the roses still clung to the wall, feeling the slight texture of the paper, the way it had bubbled and smoothed over decades of humidity and temperature changes. This wallpaper had outlasted my grandfather, had sheltered 3 generations of Ferrante women, had witnessed births and deaths and all the ordinary moments that constitute a life. If it had secrets to tell, it had kept them for a very long time. Diana appeared in the doorway. Tom thinks we have a case, at least enough to justify halting the renovation temporarily. He's drafting papers now for an emergency motion. We should be able to file first thing Monday morning. Monday? The Chens are coming back tomorrow. Then you need to stop them. Tell them about the letter, tell them you've consulted with an attorney, tell them that proceeding with the renovation could be seen as destruction of evidence if this escalates into litigation. Diana's expression was serious. Lou, if they strip the rest of this wallpaper before we can examine it properly, And if there is something hidden underneath, we lose any chance of finding it. The thought of confronting Marcus and Stephanie Chen, of asserting legal rights I wasn't even sure I had, filled me with anxiety. I wasn't a confrontational person by nature. I was the one who smoothed over conflicts at work, who avoided arguments, who generally preferred peace even at the cost of my own discomfort. But this was different. This was my home, my family's legacy, and for once in my life I needed to fight. Okay, I said, my voice stronger than I felt. I'll be here tomorrow when they come. I'll tell them they need to stop. Diana squeezed my shoulder. Good. And Lou? Save everything. Every piece of wallpaper they've already removed, every scrap. We'll need to examine all of it. If your grandmother did hide something, she would have been careful about it. It might not be obvious at first glance. After Diana left, armed with photos of the letter and promises to have a full legal strategy prepared by Monday, I stood alone in my apartment, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of my family's history. The boxes I'd pulled from the closet were still scattered across the living room floor, their contents spilling out in chaotic piles of papers and photographs and memories. I gathered the pieces of wallpaper the Chens had stripped away, finding them where they'd been carelessly tossed into a garbage bag. Most were torn, the brittle paper fragmenting after 7 decades of adhering to plaster. I spread them on the dining table, smoothing them as best I could, searching for anything unusual. Writing maybe, or documents pressed between layers. Nothing. Just roses and leaves, the pattern repeating endlessly. No secret messages or hidden papers revealing themselves. I felt foolish, like a child looking for treasure based on the flimsiest of clues. Diana's theory was creative but probably wrong. People didn't hide important documents inside walls. They put them in filing cabinets and safe deposit boxes and other sensible places. Still, I couldn't shake the memory of Nana's insistence about the wallpaper. Promise me you'll leave it, Louisa, she'd said during one of our last conversations before she died. I know it's ugly, I know you hate it, but promise me. At the time, I thought she was being sentimental, clinging to memories of Sicily and the garden she'd left behind. But what if it had been something else? What if she'd been trying to tell me something without explicitly saying it? Sleep eluded me that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of the building settling around me. Mrs. Rodriguez's television through the wall, always turned up too loud because her hearing wasn't what it used to be. The pipes clanking as someone on a lower floor ran water. The distant rumble of the subway beneath the street. These were the sounds of home, as familiar and comforting as a lullaby, and the thought of losing them felt like losing a limb. Saturday morning arrived too quickly. The Chens had said they'd be back around 10, which gave me a few hours to prepare. I made coffee, forced myself to eat breakfast even though anxiety had stolen my appetite, and rehearsed what I would say. I needed to be firm but not aggressive, clear about my legal position without making threats I couldn't back up. At 9:45, I heard voices in the hallway. The Chens were early, and they weren't alone. I recognized the voice of their contractor, someone I'd seen in the building several times over the past few weeks, a burly man named Rick who'd been overseeing various renovation projects throughout the building. I opened my door just as they approached. Marcus and Stephanie looked surprised to see me standing there, as if they'd expected me to simply absent myself during their work. Louisa, Marcus said with forced cheerfulness. We're just here to finish up with the wallpaper. Shouldn't take more than a few hours. Actually, I need to talk to you about that. You can't continue with the renovation right now. Stephanie's carefully maintained pleasant expression faltered slightly. I'm sorry, what? I took a breath, channeling every ounce of courage I possessed. I've consulted with an attorney about my situation here, and we've discovered some documents that may be relevant to my tenancy. Until we've had a chance to properly review everything, including the apartment itself, you need to stop the renovation work. Marcus's face darkened. That's ridiculous. We own this building. We have every right to renovate it. Not if doing so destroys evidence relevant to a legal dispute. Legal dispute? Stephanie's voice rose slightly. Are you threatening to sue us? I'm saying that I've found a contract between my grandmother and the previous owner that may still be binding. My attorney is reviewing it now. Until we know for certain, the responsible thing is to preserve the status quo. Rick, the contractor, looked uncomfortable, clearly wanting no part of whatever. Conflict was brewing. Maybe I should come back another time, he suggested. No, Marcus said firmly. We're proceeding as planned. Louisa, if you have a legal claim, your attorney can file the appropriate motions with the court. Until then, this is our property and we'll manage it as we see fit. He moved toward my door, clearly intending to enter the apartment with or without my permission. I stepped into the doorway, blocking his path, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. I'm denying you entry, I said, surprised by the steadiness of my voice. You'll need to leave now or I'll call the police. For a long moment we stood there in a tense standoff, Marcus glaring at me with undisguised frustration, Stephanie looking uncertain, Rick still hovering awkwardly with his toolbox. Then Stephanie touched her husband's arm. Let's not escalate this, she said quietly. If she has an attorney, let's deal with this through proper channels. We can wait a few days. Marcus looked like he wanted to argue, but after a moment he stepped back. Fine. But I'm calling our attorney today. And Louisa, if this turns out to be some kind of delay tactic, if you're just trying to postpone the inevitable, you should know that we will pursue all legal remedies available to us. I understand, I said, refusing to be intimidated. I'll have my attorney contact yours on Monday. After they left, I closed the door and leaned against it, my legs suddenly weak. I'd done it. I'd actually stood up to them, had asserted my rights, had refused to be bullied into submission. The rush of adrenaline left me shaky but also exhilarated in a strange way. For the first time in this entire nightmare, I'd taken action instead of merely reacting to circumstances. My phone rang. Diana calling for an update. They're gone, I told her. But Marcus says they're calling their attorney. This is getting real, Dee. Good, Diana said with satisfaction. Real is what we want. Tom is filing the emergency motion Monday morning. We'll request a hearing as soon as possible. In the meantime, you need to examine every inch of that apartment. If there's anything hidden, we need to find it before this goes to court. After hanging up, I stood in the bedroom doorway, surveying the partially stripped walls with new eyes. If Nana had hidden something, where would it be? The obvious answer was behind the wallpaper itself, but the Chens had already removed a third of it and found nothing. Maybe Diana's theory was wrong. Maybe I was grasping at straws, seeing patterns where none existed, desperately searching for a miracle that didn't exist. But I couldn't give up. Not yet. Not when this was my last chance to save my home. I started in the corner where the most wallpaper remained intact, examining it inch by inch, running my fingers over the surface, looking for irregularities, bumps, anything that might indicate something concealed beneath. The roses stared back at me, their pink petals eternally frozen in a pattern Nana had chosen 70 years ago, when she was a young widow trying to make a home in a foreign country, trying to build something lasting for her daughter and granddaughter. Hours passed. My back ached from bending, my eyes burned from the intense scrutiny, and I'd found nothing except the same layers of wallpaper the Chens had already exposed. Roses on top, stripes beneath, beige under that, and finally bare plaster. No hidden documents, no secret messages, nothing but the accumulated layers of decoration that marked the passage of time. I was about to give up when my finger caught on something near the baseboard, a slight ridge beneath the wallpaper that didn't match the texture around it. I pressed gently, feeling the way the paper gave slightly, as if there was a small gap between it and the wall. My pulse quickened. I carefully peeled back a small section of the rose pattern, wincing as the brittle paper tore in my hands. Beneath it was the stripe layer and beneath that the beige. But when I reached the beige layer and began to peel it away, I felt something different. The paper was thicker here, as if something had been placed against the wall before the beige layer was applied. My hands trembled as I worked more of the beige paper free, trying to be careful not to damage whatever might be underneath. The adhesive had dried and weakened over decades, making the paper come away more easily than it should have. And then I saw it. Between the beige wallpaper and the plaster wall was another piece of paper, yellowed with age, folded several times to make it flat enough to hide. I worked it free with aching slowness, terrified of tearing it, barely breathing until I had it completely separated from the wall. I carried it to the kitchen table, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unfold it. The paper was brittle, threatening to crumble at the creases, but I managed to open it carefully, spreading it flat on the table. It was a deed. A property deed for the building at 421 West 78th Street, dated July 15, 1947, transferring ownership from the previous owner to two parties, Stanislaw Kowalski and Cecilia Ferrante. My grandmother's name was right there, spelled out in formal legal language, listing her as co-owner of the building, equal partner with Kowalski, each holding a 50% interest in the property. I read it 3 times, 4 times, unable to process what I was seeing. My grandmother had owned half the building? How was that possible? Why had no one ever mentioned it? Why had she paid rent at all if she was an owner? With trembling fingers, I took photos of the deed, then called Diana. She answered on the first ring. "I found something," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I found a deed. My grandmother owned half of this building." The silence on the other end lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. Then Diana's voice, carefully controlled. "Lou, I need you to do exactly what I tell you. Take photos of that deed from every angle. Take photos of where you found it. Document everything. Then put it somewhere safe. Don't leave it in the apartment. I'm coming over right now." "But how is this possible? Why would she own half the building but pay rent?" "I don't know yet," Diana admitted. "But we're going to find out. Don't touch anything else. I'll be there in 20 minutes. I did as she instructed, photographing the deed from every angle, documenting the spot in the wall where I'd found it, carefully preserving the layers of wallpaper I'd peeled away. My mind was racing with questions, with implications I couldn't fully grasp. If Nana had owned half the building, what had happened to her ownership share? Had she sold it? Given it away? How had the Kowalskis ended up with full ownership? True to her word, Diana arrived quickly, slightly breathless from rushing. She went straight to the deed, pulling on latex gloves before touching it, handling it with the care of someone who understood its potential significance. "This changes everything," she said after examining it carefully. "If this deed was properly recorded, if your grandmother's ownership interest was legitimate, then the sale to the Chens might be invalid, at least regarding her 50% share. They would have purchased only Kowalski's half of the building." "But that was 1947, I protested. "Surely something happened between then and now. There must be other documents, transfers, something that explains why the Kowalskis ended up with full ownership." Diana was already on her phone, calling Tom, explaining in rapid-fire legal terminology what we'd found. I heard phrases like chain of title, and ownership interest, and potential fraud that made my head spin. This was beyond anything I'd imagined when I'd started searching through Nana's papers. I'd hoped to find something that might let me stay in my apartment at an affordable rent. Instead, I discovered that my grandmother might have owned half the building, that I might have inherited that ownership, that the home I'd been fighting to keep might actually belong to me. After Diana hung up, she turned to me with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. A mix of excitement and concern that made my stomach clench. "Lou, we need to go to the county clerk's office first thing Monday morning to search the property records. We need to find out if this deed was recorded, if there were any subsequent transfers, what the complete chain of title looks like. If your grandmother's ownership was never properly transferred or sold, if she retained her 50% interest until her death, then you may have inherited it." "That's impossible," I said automatically. "Nana died 10 years ago. Wouldn't someone have known? Wouldn't it have come up during the sale to the Chens?" "Not necessarily," Diana said grimly. "Title searches aren't always perfect. If the Kowalskis deliberately concealed your grandmother's ownership, if they'd been collecting rent from her and acting as sole owners for decades, it might not have been caught. Especially if your grandmother never asserted her rights, never challenged their authority. I thought about Nana, about the way she'd quietly paid her rent every month, never making waves, never demanding explanations when Michael Kowalski raised her rent in 1991. She'd been an immigrant woman without much education, someone who'd learned to keep her head down and not cause trouble. Even if she'd known about the deed, even if she'd understood what it meant, would she have fought? Or would she have been too intimidated, too convinced that people like her didn't challenge people like the Kowalskis? Why would she hide the deed in the wall? I asked. If she knew it was important, why not keep it somewhere safer? Diana considered this. Maybe she was afraid someone would find it and destroy it. Maybe there was a dispute with Kowalski that made her want to protect the evidence of her ownership. Or maybe, and I hate to say this, maybe she was starting to experience cognitive decline and wasn't thinking clearly when she hid it. That last possibility hurt to consider, but it might explain the strange placement. Nana had been sharp until very near the end, but in those last few years, there had been moments of confusion, times when she'd misplaced things or forgotten important details. If she'd hidden the deed during one of those periods, she might have thought she was being clever when really she was making it nearly impossible for anyone to find. What happens now? I asked. Now we research. We build a case. We figure out exactly what your legal position is before we approach the Chens or their attorney. Diana carefully placed the deed in a plastic folder she'd brought. This is evidence in what might become a major legal dispute. We need to treat it accordingly. I'm going to lock this in my office safe. We'll have it properly examined by a documents expert to verify its authenticity. And then we'll see where we stand. After Diana left, promising to pick me up early Monday morning for the county clerk's office, I sat alone in my apartment, trying to process everything that had happened. 24 hours ago, I'd been a month-to-month tenant facing eviction. Now, I might be the co-owner of a building worth millions of dollars. The possibility seemed so absurd, so unlikely, that I could barely wrap my mind around it. I walked through the apartment, seeing it with new eyes. If Nana had owned half of this building, then every nail she'd hammered, every wall she'd painted, every improvement she'd made hadn't been a favor to a landlord but an investment in her own property. The 1965 renovations documented in Kowalski's letter took on new significance. She hadn't been bargaining for rent reduction on someone else's building. She'd been improving her own property and having Kowalski agree to compensate her for it. But why the elaborate arrangement? Why not just split renovation costs 50-50 as co-owners would normally do? Why the fiction of rent reduction and tenant improvements? The more I thought about it, the more questions emerged, each one leading to new uncertainties. I needed answers, needed to understand the full story of what had happened between my grandmother and Stanislaw Kowalski back in 1947, what agreement they'd made and why it had been hidden for so long. I returned to the bedroom, to the wall where I'd found the deed. The hole I'd created in the wallpaper gaped like a wound, exposing the layers beneath. If there had been one document hidden in the wall, might there be others? I knelt down and began systematically examining the rest of the baseboard, feeling for other irregularities, other places where something might be concealed. An hour later, I'd found 2 more items. The first was a small leather notebook, tucked into a gap between the wall and the floorboard in the closet, protected by multiple layers of wallpaper. The second was an envelope sealed with wax, hidden in the same manner as the deed but in a different corner of the room. I brought both items to the kitchen table, my hands trembling with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The notebook was my grandmother's, her handwriting immediately recognizable on the first page. The date was July 1947, right around the time of the deed. The entries were in Italian, Nana's native language, which she'd often used for private thoughts even after decades of speaking English. I couldn't read Italian well enough to fully understand what she'd written, but I recognized some words. Kowalski, building, money, partnership, and one phrase that appeared repeatedly, written with such force that the pen had nearly torn the paper. He promised. The sealed envelope contained a letter, this one in English, addressed to whoever finds this. I opened it carefully, smoothing the brittle paper, and began to read my grandmother's words, written in what must have been one of her last coherent moments before dementia began to claim her mind. If you are reading this, something has happened to prevent me from explaining. This myself. My name is Louisa Ferrante, and I own half of the building at 421 West 78th Street. In 1947, Stanislaw Kowalski and I became partners. He had the building but no money for repairs after the war. I had money saved from my late husband Vincent's life insurance. We agreed to become equal partners. He would provide the property, I would provide the capital to make it profitable. Everything was legal, everything was recorded. The letter continued, detailing how the partnership had worked smoothly for decades, how Stanislaw had managed the building while Cecilia had lived in it rent-free as an owner, how profits were split 50-50, how major decisions were made jointly. And then in 1991, After Stanislaw died and his son Michael took over, everything changed. Michael said the partnership papers were lost. Said his father had kept poor records. Said I had no proof. He was a lawyer, I was an old woman who barely spoke English. He said I could keep living here but I had to pay rent like everyone else. I tried to argue but he threatened eviction. I paid. What else could I do? But I never forgot what was rightfully mine. I hid the proof where he would never find it, inside these walls that my money helped buy. If you find this, if you are family, know that this building is yours. Half of it has always been ours. Don't let them take what 3 generations of Ferrante women fought to keep. The letter was signed and dated May 2003, 3 years before Nana's death, when she must have still had enough clarity to understand the importance of documenting the truth even if she couldn't fight for it herself. I sat at the kitchen table as twilight fell, surrounded by the evidence of my grandmother's hidden legacy. A deed that proved her ownership. A letter that explained what had happened. A notebook that documented the original partnership. And somewhere in those county records, if we were lucky, an official recording of that 1947 deed that would prove beyond any doubt that Cecilia Ferrante had been and remained a co-owner of this building until her death. Which meant, if inheritance laws worked the way I thought they did, that ownership had passed to my mother when Nana died. And when Mama died, it had passed to me. I might not be facing eviction after all. I might be the person with the legal authority to evict the Chens from a building they had purchased under false pretenses, assuming they'd been buying 100% ownership when in reality they'd only acquired half. The implications were staggering. If we could prove all of this, if the deed held up to legal scrutiny, then the Chens hadn't just wronged me by trying to raise my rent and force me out. They'd wronged themselves by purchasing a building they didn't fully own, by spending millions of dollars on what they thought was a complete acquisition when in reality they bought only Michael Kowalski's 50% share. I thought about Marcus and Stephanie, about their renovation plans and their dreams of maximizing profit from the building. They weren't villains, not really. They were just investors who'd made what they thought was a smart purchase, who'd done their due diligence or thought they had, who had no idea that the property records were incomplete, because someone had deliberately concealed the truth decades ago. But their ignorance didn't change the facts. This building was mine, or at least half of it was. My family had paid for it with Vincent's life insurance money, had improved it with Cecilia's savings, had lived in it for 3 generations. We had roots here that went deeper than any deed or title search, roots that were also documented in legal instruments that should never have been hidden or ignored. Monday couldn't come fast enough. I needed those property records, needed to see for myself whether the deed was recorded, whether my grandmother's ownership was a matter of official record or just a private agreement that might be harder to enforce. I needed to know where I stood before the Chen's attorney came at me with whatever legal arguments they prepared over the weekend. But for now, for this moment, I allowed myself to feel something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. Real, tangible hope that I might not lose my home after all. That the ugly wallpaper Nana had insisted on keeping had protected something far more valuable than nostalgia or sentiment. It had protected the truth, the evidence, the proof of ownership that could change everything. I looked around the apartment, at the familiar walls and floors and windows that had sheltered 3 generations of my family. We belonged here. We had always belonged here. And now, finally, I had the documents to prove it. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that made everything seem possible. Diana picked me up at 7:30, both of us running on coffee and nervous energy. The county clerk's office opened at 8, and we wanted to be first in line to access the property records. The clerk who helped us was a tired-looking woman named Patricia who'd clearly been doing this job long enough that nothing surprised her anymore. Diana explained what we needed, and Patricia led us to a computer terminal where property records could be searched. She typed in the address, and we waited as the system loaded decades of documents. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. Everything depended on what these records showed. If the deed was recorded, we had a case. If it wasn't, we'd be relying on a document that might be dismissed as a private agreement with no legal weight. The first entry that appeared was dated October 2024, showing the transfer from Michael Kowalski to Marcus and Stephanie Chen. Before that, transfers going back through the Kowalski family, each one listing them as sole owners. Diana scrolled backward through time, moving past the decades, searching for 1947. And there it was. A recorded deed dated July 15, 1947, transferring the property at 421 West 78th Street from the previous owner to Stanislaw Kowalski and Cecilia Ferrante, each holding an undivided 50% interest as tenants in common. Diana let out a breath she'd been holding. Patricia leaned forward to look more closely at the screen, her professional detachment giving way to genuine interest. "Well, that's unusual," Patricia said. "If this deed was recorded, then all subsequent transfers should have required both parties' signatures or their heirs. Let me check the 1991 transfer after Stanislaw Kowalski's death." She pulled up that document and we all studied it carefully. The transfer was from Stanislaw Kowalski's estate to his son Michael, and it listed the property as passing 100% to Michael. There was no mention of Cecilia Ferrante's ownership interest, no acknowledgement that only 50% of the property was available to transfer. "This is problematic," Patricia said, with what I suspected was considerable understatement. Mrs. Ferrante's interest was never properly transferred. Then she retained her 50% ownership until her death. And if she died without a will that specifically disposed of that interest, it would have passed through intestate succession to her heirs. Diana was already pulling out her phone. "Lou, did your grandmother have a will?" "Yes, but it was simple. Everything to my mother. Mom had a will too, everything to me. They were both drafted by a legal aid attorney, nothing complicated. Those wills would have transferred the property interest even if your grandmother and mother didn't realize they owned it," Patricia explained. "Ownership doesn't disappear just because someone doesn't assert it. It passes through inheritance like any other asset." The implications were becoming clearer. When Nana died in 2014, her 50% ownership of the building had passed to my mother. When Mama died in 2020, it had passed to me. For the past 4 years, I'd been the legal owner of half the building I lived in, paying rent to the Kowalskis for a property I partially owned, completely unaware of my rights. Diana requested copies of all the relevant documents, paying the fees while I stood there trying to process what we'd discovered. Patricia printed everything, creating a thick file of deeds and transfers that told the story of how my family's ownership had been buried and forgotten. As we left the clerk's office, Diana turned to me with an expression of grim satisfaction. "The Chen's attorney is going to have a very bad day when we present this to them. They purchased a building they don't fully own. Michael Kowalski sold them property he didn't have the right to sell, at least not all of it. This is exactly the kind of title defect that title insurance is supposed to catch, but somehow it slipped through. What happens now? Now we file a quiet title action to establish your ownership. We notify the Chens and their attorney of the situation, and we begin negotiations about how to resolve this." Diana paused, considering. "Lou, you understand that you have significant leverage here? The Chens paid millions for this building, based on the assumption they were getting 100% ownership. Finding out they only own 50% changes everything." The meeting with the Chens and their attorney took place 3 days later in a conference room at Diana's firm. Marcus and Stephanie arrived with their lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Rebecca Walsh who carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to winning. Their expressions shifted from annoyance to confusion to shock as Diana laid out what we'd discovered. The deed placing ownership with my grandmother. The recorded property records proving it was legal and binding. The chain of inheritance that passed that ownership to me. The 1991 transfer that had been fraudulent, selling 100% of a property when only 50% was available to sell. Rebecca studied the documents Diana had provided, her professional mask slipping to reveal genuine concern. Marcus looked like he might be sick. Stephanie sat very still, her hands clenched together on the table. "This is absurd," Marcus finally said. "We had a title search done. We have title insurance. Someone would have caught this if it were real." "Title searches aren't infallible," Diana replied calmly, "especially when someone deliberately obscures ownership records. Michael Kowalski apparently spent decades acting as sole owner, collecting rent from all tenants including his own co-owner, never disclosing that 50% of the building wasn't his to sell. It's fraud, but it's fraud that happened gradually over time in a way that made it nearly invisible." Rebecca set down the documents. "We need time to verify all of this, to consult with our title insurance company, to determine our options." "Of course," Diana agreed. But in the meantime, all renovation work needs to stop. My client is a 50% owner of this building. She has equal say in how it's managed and what changes are made to it. Over the next several weeks, as attorneys and title insurance companies and property experts examined every aspect of the case, the truth became undeniable. I owned half of 421 West 78th Street. The Chens owned the other half, having purchased it in good faith, but from someone who'd obtained it through fraud. Michael Kowalski's estate was liable for selling property he didn't own, but he died 2 years ago and his estate had been settled, leaving no easy source of compensation for the Chen's losses. The insurance companies argued about coverage. The Chens faced the reality that they'd wildly overpaid for what they'd actually received. And I found myself in the strange position of being a property owner who'd been paying rent to live in her own building. Diana advised me that I had several options. I could force a partition sale, requiring the building to be sold and the proceeds split between the Chens and me. I could offer to buy out their half, though I'd need financing and the numbers were daunting. Or I could negotiate some kind of co-ownership arrangement, agreeing on how the building would be managed and how profits would be shared. The solution we eventually reached was complicated but fair. The Chens agreed to manage the building, handling renovations and tenant relations. I would continue to live in apartment 4B rent-free as an owner. Profits from rental income, after expenses and a management fee for the Chens, would be split 50-50. The Chens retained the option to buy out my half within 5 years at a price to be determined by independent appraisal. It wasn't perfect. Marcus and Stephanie were understandably angry about the situation, and our relationship would never be warm. But they were practical people who recognized that fighting me in court would be expensive and uncertain, and that partnership was preferable to forced sale of a property they'd already invested heavily in. The day we signed the final agreement, I stood in my apartment, looking at the bedroom walls where most of Nana's wallpaper still remained. The Chens had agreed to let me keep it as long as I wanted, a small concession that meant more to me than they probably realized. I ran my hand over the faded roses, thinking about my grandmother, about the money she'd saved from Vincent's insurance, about the partnership she'd formed with Stanislaw Kowalski, about the fraud perpetrated by his son, and about her decision to hide the evidence where no one would think to look. Inside the walls, protected by ugly wallpaper that everyone wanted to remove but she'd insisted on keeping. She'd known. On some level, even through the confusion of her final years, she'd known that the deed mattered, that it needed to be protected, that someday someone would need it. And she'd found a way to preserve it, to pass along not just memories and stories but actual proof of ownership, documentation of a legacy that had almost been stolen. Diana came by that evening with champagne to celebrate. We sat in the living room where I'd grown up, where my mother had grown up, where my grandmother had built a life after losing her husband in a foreign country at 30 years old. To Cecilia, Diana said, raising her glass. To stubborn old women who refused to let go of ugly wallpaper. To Nana, I agreed, feeling tears prick my eyes. Who taught me that sometimes the things everyone else wants to throw away are exactly the things worth keeping. 3 months later, on a cold December morning, I met with an architect to discuss renovations to my apartment. Not the extensive demolition the Chens had planned, but careful updates that would preserve the character while improving functionality. We'd keep Nana's wallpaper in the bedroom, properly preserved now under protective coating. The rest of the apartment would be gently modernized, respecting its history while making it more livable. The architect was a young woman named Sophia whose grandmother had also immigrated from Italy. She understood what I wanted, the balance between honoring the past and embracing the future. As we discussed paint colors and kitchen layouts, I thought about how much had changed in just a few months. I'd gone from facing eviction to owning half a building worth millions. I discovered a family history I'd never known, uncovered fraud that had been buried for decades, and learned that my grandmother's stubborn insistence on keeping ugly wallpaper had been protecting something far more valuable than sentiment. But more than any of that, I'd learned something about myself. That I was stronger than I'd believed. That I could fight when I needed to. That the women who'd raised me had given me more than just memories and stories. They'd given me resilience, determination, and the understanding that some things are worth fighting for no matter how impossible the odds might seem. My phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Rodriguez across the hall, asking if I'd seen the notice about the building's holiday party. The Chens were hosting it, an attempt at building community with the tenants who'd been wary of them since the purchase. I texted back that I'd be there, and I'd bring Nana's famous cookies if Mrs. Rodriguez would share her punch recipe. Small steps toward something like harmony. It would take time, but then everything worthwhile did. Nana had understood that. She played the long game, hiding evidence that wouldn't be needed for decades, trusting that eventually the truth would emerge and justice would be served. I walked to the bedroom and stood in front of the preserved wallpaper, the roses that had driven me crazy for years, that I'd promised to keep but never understood why. Now I knew. And now, finally, I could see the beauty in them. These flowers from a Sicilian garden that had traveled across an ocean in my grandmother's memory, that had decorated the walls of her American home, that had kept her secrets and protected her legacy and made sure that 3 generations of hope and stubbornness weren't wasted. Outside my window, snow began to fall on West 78th Street, covering the neighborhood in quiet white, transforming everything while leaving the essential shape of things unchanged. Buildings that had stood for a century would stand for another. Families would continue to make homes in them, laying down roots that went deeper than any deed or title search could measure. And somewhere, I like to think, Nana was satisfied that the proof she'd hidden had finally been found, that her granddaughter understood at last why some wallpaper was worth keeping. Up next.